Okay, good morning. This is chapter 6, The Duel for North America. This chapter is essential to know of the context or the causes for the eventual independence of America later. As you know, in the end, America will become independent, right? That's what's going to happen. But what causes them to desire this independence, to be separated from Britain, to be anti-British? This is actually in here in chapter 6. It's the way they were treated and it's the way the British have took advantage of them. So this explains that kind of context that starts it all, the beginning of it, that will lead to more of these desire to be separated from Britain and then to eventually become the the United States of America. So you can see it ends at 1763. This duel for North America. All right. So this is called the duel for North America because there's two countries actually that's going to compete for North America, and that's the Native Americans and England. Now Spain is there too, but Spain really took Central America, which is today's Mexico, and more south. But the northern part was really a battle between France and America. Sometimes we call this war that they're going to have between the British and the French. We call this the 7 Years' War, or commonly known in U.S. history, the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is not a war between the French and the Indians. It is a war between the French and the British in America, and both sides will have Indians among their side, actually. So let's go learn about the background of this situation, especially about France. So we got to know a little bit about France. So France was also having a civil war between Roman Catholics and Protestants. So in France, there were some people joining the Protestants, and then there were some Catholics who were against that. But a lot of the Protestants were being persecuted and even killed for their faith. So even men, women, and children were killed for becoming a Protestant. Until 1598, the Edict of Nantes, they granted limited toleration to the French Protestants. So because of this, religious wars stopped in France, and then the nation was able to become united, just like when all the civil war stopped in England, right? Now we have this nation to become united, the French. And then King Louis became the king. Okay. So King Louis at this time was just as jealous, seeing that the Spanish were also planting colonies and also the English planting colonies. So guess what? It's the French's turn to also plant colonies. So the French wants to plant some colonies, and they were able to do it in the St. Lawrence River, which is today's Quebec. Okay, that's their first colony name. Just like England is Jamestown, but for the French is Quebec, and that's actually just 1 year after Jamestown. And the man who was the leading figure, explorer, was his name is Samuel de Champlain, right? Also known as the father of New France. Okay, that's also a vocabulary term there. The kind of Native Americans that were living in this region in Quebec was the Huron Indians, right? And the Huron and the French actually were, partners in a tag team, and they even helped to defeat the Iroquois around New York. So the French were able to also make some allies with the Native Americans. Now you have the French coming down into North America in today's Ohio, right? Because they're in Canada. Today's Canada, that's where the French landed, in today's Canada. And of course, what do you think they're going to call their whole new nation? They didn't call it Canada yet. Just like the Spanish called Central America New Spain, the English called England New England, and the French are going to call their place New France, right? Go figure. So they were different because they didn't have that much democracy. So the French living in New France were in direct control under the king. But their population was different. Actually, there was only 60,000 people who lived in New France or Canada. But compared to America or the English, there was, 2.5 million, right? That's like so much, 60,000 all over Canada. Guam's population is bigger than that. So, but still, that's the French's territory. That was New France. Okay. Now you might think, oh, did the French Protestants move there? The Protestant Huguenots? No, they weren't allowed to go there. So it was really not a place to immigrate. The king didn't allow it. It was strictly for business. Now, if you look at the map, you realize that wow, there was just so much English history, but in reality, French had the biggest territory, so there was more things to talk about with them. Shouldn't there be more events? But there wasn't that much people there. Okay, so here are the three nations competing. Green is in England, pink is in France. It's a big territory. They own this middle part of America, and you have the Spanish in blue here. Okay. So what were the French doing as a business? All these in red circles are French trading posts. They were trading beaver hats. right? Beaver was a luxurious style to wear. That was their main profit in their economy, for beavers. So you had a bunch of these French fur trappers. And this is, in other words, they were called coureurs de bois. This is a French word, and they meant runner of the woods. Now, runner of the woods simply means that these guys were running because they were trying to catch these beavers. So this is a vocabulary term, actually, coureurs de bois, runners of the woods, just named with the French people in North America trying to, catch all the beavers. Now, they were just catching it with their bare hands, but they would leave traps all over the woods, and the beavers would fall into it. That's how they would get the beavers. And then with that, they would also, after they trapped the beavers, then they would skin the beavers for some business. And they even recruited some Native Americans into that fur business, right? So they slaughtered a lot of beavers. So many beavers were slaughtered just to wear them. Okay, besides for the population of of French people going there for beavers, there was also another kind of people going there. Another reason for the French going there, and they were missionaries. A lot of them were really trying to convert the Native Americans into Catholicism. So the Jesuits of the French were also there too. All right, so you have some explorers here besides, the father of New France. What's his name again? Samuel de Champlain. You also have Antoine Cadillac, who founded Detroit. Does his last name sound familiar? Cadillac? Because Detroit became the automobile manufacturing center. Detroit, Rock City, right? Detroit, and they named it after him, Cadillac. Also, Robert de La Salle was the one that went as far south as you can through the Mississippi. Then he ended up coming out into the Gulf of Mexico. So he named the entire basin Louisiana, right? That's why that little state in the bottom, the state of Louisiana, that was actually originally a French name, Louisiana. Actually, the whole middle part at that time was named Louisiana. French officials persisted in their efforts to block Spain on the Gulf of Mexico. So actually, whoever controls this Mississippi River pretty much controls the trade. So whoever controls that river, it's like the main road because boats would use it, right? So New Orleans was the most important port commanding the mouth of the Mississippi River. This strategic semi-tropical outpost also tapped the fur trade of the huge interior valley. So Louisiana, New Orleans, that's where it was almost like the capital because that's where the money would come in because of the trade. Okay, now we have some wars. Before the French and Indian War, there were a few wars the British were already going through. King William's War, Queen Anne's War. Okay, these wars forced the British to go against the French coureurs de bois. So this is British versus the French, little battles here and there. Okay, now the problem was the Indians were allies with the French, and the French and the Indians, they ravaged the British colonies in the frontier. Now, in the frontier, meaning the backwoods, right? This is the English, and the English is backwoods. It's near France. So what would happen is, the French would support the Native Americans to go and burn some British villages because they were already at war with each other anyway. So the British people, a lot of times, would have some problems with the Native Americans and the French who were in that region. So Schenectady, New York is one example. And so the British wanted to get revenge. So they tried to attack Quebec and Montreal, okay, but scored only a single victory. They temporarily seized the stronghold of Port Royal in Acadia. So they were trying to get their main towns, right? Quebec and Montreal, the main colonies, but they couldn't. It was very difficult. But they were able to get this Port Royal, Nova Scotia, which is New Scotland at that time. It was called. Okay, and they changed the name from that to. So they had peace, Treaty of Utrecht between France, so-called a temporary peace, but still the French and even the Spanish, actually the Spanish and the French, they're allies against Britain. So you can see that they're going to cause trouble soon. So because of that peace, they were able to also get Newfoundland. So Newfoundland and they got Hudson Bay. So from these battles here, Queen Anne's War, okay, because of these battles, they were able to, the British got the Hudson Bay here. Notice how it turned green now. This used to be red. And they also got this one, Newfoundland, that used to be red. It used to belong to the French. So they were just here, but now they've expanded even more so. So they got this. Now you see the French getting smaller, right? We know in the end, this is all going to be America's. Okay, they had a war because of a man named British Captain Jenkins. Okay, now this captain, he encountered a Spanish, kind of like a tax collector, right? And then this Spanish guy cut off the ear of British Captain Jenkins. They hated each other, and then he cut off his ear, the British. And they had a war. Britain had a war. It was the War of Jenkins' ear. Yeah, it was a brilliant ear, I guess, to have a war over. So that war spread even up into the Caribbean, even as far as the Philippines. War of Austrian Succession, King George's War. Okay, so they had all these. peace treaty of 1748. They had a peace treaty, and then they gave back Louisbourg, which the British took, and then they said, okay, make peace, we'll give you back Louisbourg. And this is what made Americans upset. I mean, the British Americans upset. They worked so hard to get Louisbourg from the French, and then the British gave it back to the French, saying, okay, we'll give this back to you, just do not, make any problems with us. So this is what really upset them. Okay, now here we are, getting closer to the beginning of the French and Indian War. Okay, first of all, as you know, this area is sensitive. This here is French territory. You can see how it's Fort Presqu'île Isle, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Venago, French. And then you have Fort Necessity, British fort. Now, Fort Duquesne and Fort Necessity, a French fort, a French base, and a British base are so close together. But George Washington, yes, George Washington, when he was 21 years old, before he was president, was responsible for starting the French and Indian War, so to say. George Washington was a surveyor of land. He goes to land, plots it on a map, and then he sells that part to wherever. The Virginians made a purchase on this Virginia land, or this area near Pennsylvania. But the French said, no, we're building a fort here. But the Washington says, no, this is British land. We paid for it. Why are you building a fort here? So George Washington sent soldiers, right? He sent soldiers. On the way to Fort Duquesne, George Washington encountered French troops. And George Washington and his troops fired first to the French. Now, George Washington was 21 years old. He was very cocky. There was bullets flying near him, and he was really cocky and arrogant. He says, I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound. He's saying the bullets sounded beautiful, I guess, when they were going near his body. The French turned around and, came back and got revenge, actually. They said, you know what? We're going to come down there. And they came to Fort Necessity, 10-hour siege, surrounded the fort, and George Washington surrendered, and they lost that fort. But that was just the first battle, okay? Now, the French Acadians, whom Britain had conquered in 1713, the British brutally uprooted 4,000 of them in 1755. Now, as a response to this, beginning of the French and Indian War, there were some French people who were living in Nova Scotia. Remember how the British took that back, or took it from the French? And there were some French living there, and to make the French upset, they took all those French people and moved them to Louisiana. That's why these French-speaking Acadians are called Cajun, famous for Cajun fried chicken. Okay, so anyway, this is the beginning of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. These are the same thing. It was fought not only in America, but in Europe, the West Indies, and the Philippines, even Africa, and on the ocean. You're probably wondering, what about the Philippines? Why is that? Because there were some British there already trading, and the Philippines became a port for many European nations. Okay, now Britain had Prussia on one side, and France, Spain, and Austria, and Russia were on the other side. Okay, so there was this already alliance. Now Prussia, what's Prussia? Prussia is near today's Germany, all right, more on the east side of it. So they had an ally with them, the British. Okay, so there was this alliances already. Okay, so there was a lot of Germans. Now, this 1754, there was this attempt. Remember, there was several colonies. There was 13 colonies. However, they weren't as united yet. So Benjamin Franklin tried to unite them. So they tried to get everyone, one representative or representatives, to meet together. Okay, and they gave some weapons to the Iroquois tribes, and they all tried to work all together, all the colonies, all the Indians, let's go join all together. That's why he called this the Albany Congress. Join or die was the slogan. We have to join as one United States. This was an attempt to become united. Now we know they're going to be united eventually and become the United States of America in 1776, but they tried to do it already earlier. And that was in the Albany Congress. But people couldn't agree. They said, you know what? They didn't want to join together to form the United States or United Colonies to fight against the French. That's fine. They will do it 20 years later. Okay. Now that the war has begun, the bigger war, French and Indian War, they had some bad generals. And they realized that they really had to change their tactics because they were fighting old style. The British were different. They fought in kind of like a gentleman's warfare, where you just stand in a straight line or stand in a row, and you look at the enemy. You don't take cover, you don't duck, and you shoot, right? You just shoot in front of them. You don't try to cover yourselves because you're supposed to be brave and not a coward, right? That was the style of fighting. But the French didn't fight like that. They knew they couldn't fight like that. So what happened is the French learned to fight like the Indians, where they hide and they ambush, and then they jump them, and then they run back in. And Braddock couldn't fight against that way. General Braddock failed in fighting, even though the French had a smaller army with the Indians. Because of that, they had to go back. The British had to retreat. They couldn't capture Fort Duquesne. Okay, and so the British said, you know what? Let's go launch a full-scale invasion of Canada. Let's get the whole thing. Wasn't easy to do. Easier said than done. What really had to change was the leader. So they changed the leader. They got a younger guy, William Pitt. So got rid of Bradford. They did younger people who would do new tactics, who would be more daring, and not do this obvious, fight in front and let everyone see you and don't duck and cover. And they hired this guy, William Pitt. And so he was a young leader. And then they knew that Pitt said, we got to choose young guys. He also picked young and energetic leaders, thus bypassing the incompetent and cautious old generals. And Pitt launched his first expedition to Louisbourg. Okay. And then he took Louisbourg. And then Quebec was next on Pitt's list. Now, Quebec is, remember, it's the main fortress of New France, of Canada at that time. Okay. And Pitt, he knew he had to he selected young guys, right? He selected Wolfe, who was a young guy. Now, young guys will do daring things. Young guys have a crazier imagination and a wilder one than old people. Old people are always playing safe. But Wolfe had a good idea. He says, you go to the front, and then as a distraction, but I will bring my team, Wolfe says, he'll bring his detachment, his platoon, and he'll hike up the hill behind the city. We'll climb the mountain, basically, and we're going to get them from behind. They would have never think they're going to climb the mountain, right? The French would never think that. So while the French were facing the gates of Quebec, Wolfe and his platoon was coming from behind the French leader. So the French were under Marquis de Montcalm, and Marquis didn't know that there was British troops behind him, and so eventually Montreal or Quebec fell into the hands of the British thanks to Wolfe. Unfortunately, Wolfe died, so he didn't get to celebrate his credit. But also Marquis de Montcalm also died. So once Quebec fell, and then after that, Montreal fell, and then the French flag was gone from Canada. Peace treaty in Paris, French power was thrown completely off the map. There was never a French colony in America again. The French territory was given all to British America. So Britain just like quadrupled in size because they kicked out the French and took their territory. Okay. The only thing that the French got were some West Indies islands or some Caribbean islands there. And because Spain was upset, Spain said, you French people better give us something. So they gave Spain all of the Mississippi, Louisiana, and New Orleans. And for its part, turned Florida over to Britain, at least for a while. They're going to give it back to the Spanish later. So this is what happened. So, they hiked from the back. Okay, this is one picture of it. So here is the French army, right? French army, and then they hike from the back. This is Wolfe's idea, and that's what caused this victory. Now, why does this make Americans change their mind from siding in America? When the British came in, they hired a bunch of Americans, or Americans got recruited, but they disrespected the British Americans, and they knew that these British people, so-called Great Britain, the British Americans realized they're not that great. We know their weaknesses. And the British people always treated the British colonials or the British Americans as boors and pigs and scum, and incompetable dogs. So the British Americans were already feeling like, we don't want to be British anymore. These guys are so cocky and they treat us low and they despise us. So this is why they were starting to feel anti-British. They knew the British wasn't that great. So remember the map that I showed you? So this is it all here. All the French was here at one point. And now there's no red at all. It's only two colors, Spain and Britain. These guys are going to be left in a way, right? Now, why did Spain grow big a little bit? Because the French gave them that part because the Spanish were upset that that the French didn't win. The French says, okay, we'll give you this part. Okay. So we can see that the British Americans started to not like the British. They didn't want to even help the British. Okay. And in reality, even though they were both British ancestors, were the same, but little by little, culturally, they were different. They had different religions. Anglican, Puritan are two different ones. And there's not only British Americans there's also different nationalities. Remember, there was also the German Americans, Scots, Irish, a mixture of a lot. So they weren't really 100% British people. There were some foreigners who came in there, Europeans. And they had different kinds of governments. They didn't come under the king. They had their own governor that they followed, their own legislature. So there was a lot of differences already with these British Americans who are also British citizens, but they weren't the same as British people in Britain. Yes, they spoke the same language and shared the same ideals, but they would eventually go to war sooner or later. And so what happened is after the war, there was some Native Americans who weren't happy. Why? Because remember, the French had allies, right? The Hurons and even the Ottawa Indians. And even though the French surrendered, the Native Americans didn't surrender. They said, "Who said we surrendered?" So the Native Americans kept fighting, actually. Okay. And the Ottawa Chief Pontiac, again, Pontiac named near Detroit, right? Like the car. But the Ottawa chief, he started to attack British Americans living near Ohio, British colonials, British Americans living near his area, even though there was a peace. So what to do? Because, these Native Americans killed 2,000 soldiers and settlers, British Americans. So one British commander pretended to have peace with them, but he instead gave blankets of infected smallpox and gave it to the Indians. And that's how he tricked them, and they got weaker. And then the British came in and slaughtered them while they were weak. Okay. So now that the Native Americans are taken care of, well, not completely, but a lot of Americans were trying to migrate into that new region, right? They're trying to migrate here, but how can the British people protect the colonists from the Native Americans? Now, the Americans are trying to migrate. The British are saying, "Hey guys, don't go there yet. Even though we're both the same, we're one country, but we can't protect you that far. The Native Americans are crazy. Remember what happened?" So they made a law, Proclamation of 1763, but they found a shortcut. This proclamation says it is prohibited for any settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Do not go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, do not go beyond this. Do not settle yet until it's ready. It's not ready yet. Okay, until they work out the Indian problem. But still, a lot of Americans trickled into Tennessee, Kentucky, sneaking in, defying the proclamation. More people moving in, and so how is this going to become a problem in the future? To protect these colonials, British Americans moving into this new place, they have to send soldiers. The soldiers need to be paid. In order to pay the soldiers, you got to raise taxes. Raise taxes against the colonials, they have to pay a lot of money. They're upset at that. So you're going to have all this taxation without representation, all that stuff. So this happens because of the new land that they got. It seemed like the British didn't want to give the British Americans, the British colonials, this new land. So they're going to be more anti-British at this time. Okay, we'll talk about that in the next chapter. So that's it. This is the French and Indian War, how they kick out the French out of it. And now British took more territory than ever at this point. Okay, we'll end with that. All right, good morning. Now we're finally at the road to revolution. So this is the causes for America's independence. This is the revolution where they will have eventually all these taxation, all these complaints that they're having against Britain, against the parliament, and finally they will get their independence. So we have to understand some of the political things here. For example, this term republicanism. Now, at this time, the world was changing in terms of their politics. Most of the world was following the monarchy system, king and queen stuff. But there wasn't really a full-on democratic, or in this case, republic practice like the Greeks and Romans did, where they had representatives to represent their government. So a king doesn't represent them, right? A king just inherited, and he inherits the kingship, then he passes down to the son. But a republic is when a citizen is representing them and is only doing what the people want. That's why they define it as defined as a just society, as one in which all citizens willingly subordinate their private selfish interests to the common good. Okay? So this means like these leaders are not doing it for themselves, they're doing it for the people, according to the interests and the wills, the requests of the people. A king may not always do the requests or the will or the interests of the people. So this is this side of republic is called this kind of focusing more on the rights of the people. Now, in Parliament in Britain, there's like this kind of like a Congress, right? In Congress in America, you have the Democrats, you have the Republicans. Likewise, at this time in the Parliament, they had on the left side the Tories, which is kind of like the conservatives, and the radical Whigs, which were like the liberals. And the Whigs were supportive of rights. So they were supportive of colonist rights because that's what they support, rights. So whenever someone's right or the people's rights is being abused, the Whigs always support the people. The Tories tend to support the king, the power of the king, the authority of the king, because they believe power controls the people when people is out of control. But the Whigs support the rights of the people and their freedoms. So you're going to have these two, okay? Republican and Whig ideas. And these ideas of representation of the rights of the people is going to have a lot of American communist philosophy in this. Okay, so that is a political background of it. Okay, so mercantilism and colonial grievances. Now, what does this mean? So, all the others were haphazardly found by trading companies, religious groups, or land speculators. Okay. Um, the colonies are mainly money making places, right? Even though they are religious groups, still they are providing money for Britain in some form. And so, mercantilism, this is a vocabulary term, it is the philosophy in which the colonies will make money for Britain. And the more money that goes into Britain, then the more powerful it becomes than other European nations. So this is kind of the forerunner to capitalism. The goal is they have to import or they have to export more than they import, but they cannot import more than they export. So the more they export means the more they're selling their goods, more people are buying their goods. That means gold is coming in. But if they're importing too much, then that means they're buying from other countries, and that's not good. Now, of course, you can't just tell a country, hey, buy my goods, but I'm not going to buy yours. It won't work that way. There has to be a trade. We just hope that the balance of the trade falls on Britain's favor. So that's mercantilism. Okay, it means that the more gold and silver to go into that country. Okay. So in order to have the most gold and silver, this is where the American colonies come in. The colonies are responsible for providing the products, the resources, the tobacco, sugar, the wood for the ships, and then Britain will sell it for them to other nations. That means America cannot directly sell it to Spain or France or Germany or whatever. Britain will do it. But then America has to give the Britain the goods. So really, the American colonists, the British colonists are doing all the work. Okay. So to avoid British Americans, now these British Americans are not full Americans, but I'm trying to make a difference between British Americans and British people. There's British Americans who are living in America who aren't independent yet. They're still British people, and then there's just the British people who are living in Britain, obviously. If British Americans trade with the French directly, then the money will go to the British Americans. But the British don't want that. They want the money to go to Britain. So that's why they make this navigation law, meaning that all commerce needs to go to Britain first. No one sell anything directly to other European countries. If you're going to sell something, it has to pass through a British port, a British ship, and so forth, so that the British would make the money. So of course, this is like preventing America from trading with other nations. It's like a monopoly. They're forcing them to not buy from other nations. Okay, so if America is not having paper money, or there was no money coming into America, then if there's no gold or silver, but only gold and silver is going out, then how are they going to use the money to buy anything else? So that was going to be an issue here. Okay, so we call this philosophy mercantilism. So what's going to happen? America can't just be poor and say, hey, we just got to keep selling only to Britain, giving it only to Britain. That's the law. Of course, they're going to smuggle. They're going to illegally trade with other industries. They're going to sell their tobaccos to the French in the Caribbean. They're going to sell their wheat to the Spanish, and hopefully the British doesn't realize it. So you call this smuggling. Okay. Now, this is the beginning of taxing the British Americans. Now, there is a huge debt, 140 million pounds of debt because of the French and Indian War that happened. Now, how do you pay off the debt? Well, you got to pass some taxes. So the Prime Minister of Britain, which is like the head of the Parliament, the head of their Congress in Britain, Prime Minister George Grenville had an idea to pass the Sugar Act. Okay, it was a duty on foreign sugar imported from the West Indies. A duty is a tax. So anything that's being imported from the Caribbean, the West Indies, they have to pay a tax. But what's significant is this was the first of all the taxes passed by that body for raising tax revenue in the colonies. So this is the first one. People didn't like that. Okay, they're now starting to pay taxes, and they didn't even realize it. And they just suddenly realized, well, why am I paying extra money for this sugar? Well, that's just the law that was passed. And then there's the Quartering Act. Now, remember how there's a proclamation of 1763 when they said, okay, no one move to the interior part of America, because remember the Native Americans started attacking people, Ottawa. So all their soldiers trying to prevent them from going in. But where would these soldiers live? The soldiers didn't have a base. The soldiers didn't have like a home, barracks. So the colonists would provide the home. This is the Quartering Act. And they would also provide food. So this is another burden on the colonists. You got the Sugar Act, you have this Quartering Act, and then stamps were required for every bill of sale, a stamp tax, right? So the Stamp Act was now being passed, the Stamp Act. So this is supposed to be in red. So, sometimes you guys have to listen to the lecture because I will tell you what term would have been missing, a stamp tax. A stamps were required on bills, and then they would have to pay an extra tax for any legal document. Okay, like let's say you're getting a license on whatever, you have to pay a stamp to prove that it's legit, you pay a tax. So they're basically just finding all kinds of ways to tax the colonists so they can pay the debt. Now, the colonists started to complain. They said, this is not fair. No one ever told us. No taxation without representation. Now, what does this mean? The colonists felt like you have no right to tax us because you never asked us, and you couldn't ask us because we have no one in parliament. So this is true. Out of the 13 colonies, there's no representative going to parliament to represent Georgia, Massachusetts, Virginia. There's no one guy sitting in the London parliament. That's why they're crying out no taxation without representation. At least ask our representative, and then we could decide how much we could be taxed. We don't mind paying taxes. The only problem is you didn't ask us how much we could pay. We would pay. So there's something wrong with the system. The Americans believe that there was no one to represent the Americans in the colonies. That's why they're crying out no taxation without representation. There was no colonist representing the American colonies in the London Parliament. Okay, so they conceded the right of Parliament to legislate about matters that affected the entire empire, including the regulation of trade, but they denied the right of Parliament in which no Americans were seated to impose taxes. Only their elected legislatures, the Americans insisted, could legally tax them. So who has the right to decide on the tax? The Americans believed it was only their colonial legislatures within the colony that will decide it. So what's this a fair argument? No taxation without representation. You could tax us only if we are being represented. Prime Minister Grenville said, you are being represented. Virtual representation. Meaning the people in parliament, they're already representing you virtually. Even though they're not someone from Georgia, but that guy sitting there is also representing you, deciding for your own good. So that is what they mean by this no taxation. What's so significant is they forced the Americans to deny the authority of parliament altogether and to begin to consider their own political independence. This put the colonists in a position to say, hey, if they don't give us representation, then we're going to form our own kind of parliament. We should form our own kind of political voice. Okay, so they're starting to think of independence, think of starting their own government. All right. Now, they formed a Congress, a group, a meeting, the Stamp Act Congress, to respond to the stamp tax. 27 delegates from the 9 colonies. They were saying, what should we do? Okay, so after dignified debate, they drew up a statement of their rights and grievances and beseeched the king and parliament to repeal. So they basically wrote a letter to the king and parliament. Hey, take out the taxes. We are suffering because of this. Now, what's significant about this Congress is it was a significant step, look at that, it says significance, towards intercolonial unity. Remember how we had to have all the 13 to be united, right? That's going to happen to form the United States of America. But there's 9. It's growing. They're starting to become united, but not all 13 just yet. Now, the Congress says, okay, how can we respond to this suffering, to the suffering that we are receiving? Non-importation. Let's all agree to not import British goods. Let's not buy any import from Britain. Don't buy any imports or goods or whatever. Okay, and then we're all going to just make them suffer economically like that, the British, so they won't make any money. And whoever's going to try to buy British goods, careful. There's this group called the Sons of Liberty or the Daughters of Liberty who took the law to their own hands, and they're forcing people, this group saying, hey, you guys better not buy British goods. If you do buy British goods, then you're supporting them. So they would persecute people who support the British. And unfortunately, they would even harass some people by pouring hot tar and feathers on them. Okay, so can you imagine to collect taxes on the stamps? If you're a British worker, a tax collector, you have to collect taxes, and then you have these Sons of Liberty who are saying, hey, stop trying to make us pay taxes, right? There's going to be some trouble. There's going to be some trouble eventually. But did this work? Did not paying for British goods work? Yes, it did. There was the people who didn't pay for it. They were able to not make money in Britain, and they said, you know what? We're not making money. It's working. They're not buying our goods. Okay, we repeal it. They repealed the Stamp Act. This is another significance. This is orange, right? So in the end, it was repealed. They took it. So it may seem like a win, like you're right, Americans, British Americans, we do not have the right to tax you, right? So what did Parliament do? They passed an act, declaratory act, reaffirming Parliament's right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. You're right. There is no law that says no one's being represented, but they just made a new law that we have a right to do whatever we want to the colonies. That's the law that they made. It's significant because they say absolute sovereignty over the colonies. We could do whatever we want. Says who? Says the law we just made. So they made this law. They could just make any law to show that they're the boss over the British colonists. Okay, now we're getting to the Boston Massacre. Now there's a new prime minister, Champagne Charlie Townshend, and he passed the Townshend Act. And it's another tax, an indirect tax on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Okay, and so instead of paying the tax in the store, you would pay it when the ship arrives at the port. So whenever someone is going to get their goods, they have to pay the tax there. So then eventually the guy who gets the goods has to raise the price in the store, right? So there's this sneak attack that they're trying to do to raise money. Okay, so this was what they were trying to do. Okay. Now the naughtiest of the colonies was really Boston, Massachusetts. They weren't going to pay those taxes. Now, remember, it was also a tax on tea, right? There's a tea tax in this. Okay. Um, in this tax, there was a lot of people upset at British soldiers in Boston. So on March 5, this is what happened. When the tax collectors were, they had kind of an apartment where they're staying at. And then there's this protest going on, right? Getting crazy and crazy until, in this apartment, of course, the British soldiers are standing guard. You know how the British soldiers stand, like, don't move until they get crazy. If they hit you, then you have a right to shoot. Well, anyway, they were protesting, and then, protesting at the apartment, at their front yard in a way, until one soldier shoots. And if one soldier shoots, everyone shoots. The captain didn't even say shoot. And so basically they shot at the crowd of innocent people, so-called innocent. An 11-year-old boy died and all that. That was called the Boston Massacre. It was printed on the newspapers. The massacre at Boston. Look at these British people shooting innocent people. The media portraying this fake news. Basically, it wasn't really a massacre. Okay, only a few were killed and 11 were wounded. And the British people, they had a court case to see what happened. John Adams became a lawyer, but not for the colonist side, for the British soldier side. John Adams, the second president, the future second president, he would become a lawyer for the British side. And they discovered that someone hit the British soldier with a club, and that's why the British soldier shot. So it was actually the protesters' fault. Sometimes you don't have to believe the media. You have to trust what the court says and judges. Okay, King George III, then only 32 years old. Okay, this is about him. Good man. Okay, he is now the current ruler who's going to be in these colonies, working with the Prime Minister Lord North. Okay, so John Adams, his cousin is Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams was really the guy rallying people up against the British because he's one of the founders of the Sons of Liberty. They formed the Committees of Correspondence. Okay, they meaning the people were able to set up a committee in each colony so they could unite together by sharing information. Now, this is very difficult to do. It's hard to be united. Why? It's because the East Coast, the 13 colonies, is so huge, so far. How can you say, hey, let's all protest at the same time? Well, who's going to tell the guy down in Georgia that's like 1 month away to give a message? So it's very difficult unless you have this Committee of Correspondence to make it easy. So they're basically able to spread and share information. Okay. Now, they said Virginia led the way, and then within a short time, every colony had a central committee. And eventually, this is significant because this would lead to, they evolved directly into the first American Congresses. This is what it's going to lead to. There's going to be more meetings, First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, and that started because of these committees of correspondence. Okay. So now, because of the non-importation that they decided to not import, the Americans had a good idea to make the British suffer economically. And one company that was suffering was the British East India Company, which sells tea. They have a lot of tea, and no one's buying it. So they have a plan. I know, let's make our tea cheap. Okay, let's find a way to help out the British East India Company. So the government says, no taxes. This tea doesn't have any taxes, so there's no extra pay. But that's not fair, because the Americans' tea requires tax. So they try to make British goods attractive by taking out the tax, but they wouldn't take a tax on American tea. So these two companies, the British supported the British East India Company, but not the American companies. So because of all of this, America did something. If the British East India Company tried to sell tea, it all went crazy. And people tend to forget this. But before we get into the Boston Tea Party, there were some tea ships were coming to Philadelphia, New York, and Maryland. And you know what they did to the British East India Company? They burned the ships. They burned the cargo. So it wasn't only like the Boston Tea Party, but Everywhere it was crazy. Okay. And they even got mad at the governor. Of course, the famous one was when at night the Bostonians, the people of Massachusetts, they dressed up as Indians and dumped 342 chests of tea. And you can imagine that of course they're trying to show them that it was not them, it was the Indians, but of course it was the Native Americans. Unless I'm pretty sure when they were looking at these Indians, they were like, oh, these guys are all white people, right? They were probably said, hey, is that Uncle Tom dumping tea? They were pretty obvious. They were actually British American colonists dumping the tea because they were upset that they made the tea cheap, but not the others. Okay, and that is what you might think like, well, it's cheap tea. No, they don't care about that cheap or not. They were upset that they were cheating. They were cheating the price. Okay, so because they dumped the tea, of course, that's property, right? That's the Boston British East India Tea. So what they did is they passed the Intolerable Acts. The prime minister, along with the Boston Port Act, they closed the port and also passed a bunch of other intolerable acts, closed the port, and they sent a lot of soldiers to naughty Massachusetts. Okay. Now, what's Quebec doing here? What's Canada doing here? 13 colonies, right? Did you notice we never heard about Quebec acting up, even though they're part of the colonies? That's because the British did something here. They helped them out. They said, hey, we'll pass this Quebec Act, which means we're going to extend your borders and also allow you to practice your Catholic religion. We will protect you because remember, it's a Protestant nation, right? So the French were guaranteed to practice it. And then they spread a little bit more this way for the Canadians. Okay. Continental Congress. So to prevent the Canadians from rebelling, it was just the 13 colonists now. Remember, there was other colonies, including the one in Quebec and Montreal, they didn't rebel. Okay, bloodshed. So it's ascending, right? It's increasing. The level of protest, damages, violence is increasing. And they said it's time to meet. So they formed the Continental Congress and they met in Philadelphia. And they kind of sent the best of the best men of every colony: Samuel Adams, John Adams, George Washington, Patrick Henry, the bright minds, political minds. Now, what did they do in this first Continental Congress? They said, we want to appeal. Let's go write some papers. The Declaration of Rights, as well as appeals for other British colonies. Okay, it's supposed to be yellow. And what's significant is they formed this association. And they called for, again, non-importation, non-exportation, non-consumption. Again, to boycott British goods, do not buy. So they did two things in this meeting. They said they wrote an appeal that the rights of the people are being abused. And they are saying we're not going to buy any British goods. But in this first meeting, they didn't call for independence yet. That's going to be in the second one. The first one, they just did this. They were trying to play it safe. They were trying to say, hey, let's make peace. We have a complaint here. Okay. So just know that they sent that letter. Muskets were gathered. Okay, so Parliament rejected the Congress's petitions. And the Parliament says you guys are all violating the law. Muskets were gathered, men began to drill openly, and a clash seemed imminent. In April 1775, Lexington and Concord. Now, something happened here. There was weapons in Lexington and Concord. This is like the backcountry of Massachusetts. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were there. And the British heard about it. Wow, they have a bunch of weapons. Are they preparing an army? Let's confiscate it. So they were going to confiscate the weapons. Okay. So while they were headed there, actually, the weapons were gone because Paul Revere rode his horse real fast in the middle of the night and warned them that the British are coming, the British are coming. And that's why when the British came, there was no weapons in Lexington and Concord. So the British turned around. Let's go back to Massachusetts. There's nothing here. But when they turned around on the way back, there was a bunch of colonists. And they were blocked away. And then they shot at the British. Once again, if one person shoots, everyone shoots. And so the British ran back to Massachusetts. So this is starting to grow. This is already, battles are starting now, right? But not really, but they haven't declared war yet. Okay, just so you know that once you shoot the British and you send hundreds of people, it automatically means this is war. They're going to send back more military soon. So let's look at their strengths and weaknesses. It's 7.5 million Britons versus 2.5 million colonists. So there's more British people. But 30,000 Germans or Hessians were going to be employed. The British are going to hire them. There's some 50,000 loyalists there. Okay, so the British people may seem weak, but they had some experience. Okay, but Britain was weak because at these areas, all the people were in Ireland, so they couldn't send troops early. And a lot of the generals were old. There was no William Pitt, like young ones, like that fought the French-Canadian War well. Okay. Many of the British did not want to fight the American cousins. They said no. So it was really hard to hire someone to go down there. A lot of them actually felt sorry for the British Americans. So the British people weren't so united about this. Okay. Now, what about the British Americans? The generals were second rate. The soldiers were not even trained. Okay. But what advantage did the British Americans have? Well, the British base was 3,000 miles away. So they're fighting in British American territory, and it's bigger than Britain, right? So the Americans know their stuff. Okay. They had George Washington. They had Benjamin Franklin. George Washington was a giant among men. He was so popular, like a moral figure. People would follow him and obey him. Benjamin Franklin was a master of diplomats, meaning he knew how to talk well to get some allies in other countries. And the French people even supported America. They got this guy who gave a lot of money. So French is Britain's enemy, right? So if America's enemy is Britain, and also the French enemy. Okay. Of course, they still had to organize very well. So it says here a thin line of heroes. Yes, there wasn't much heroes. There wasn't much gunpowder. There wasn't much training for troops. They had some general food supply. Clothing and shoes were very limited, so they didn't have much materials. The British Americans, not much training. Okay, thankfully, one guy, German Baron von Steuben, Prussian German, was willing to train the Americans, but it was very difficult. 5,000 black people had enlisted, so this is the plus and minuses. Now, the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, he was going to cause some problems. All right, he promised that if any African American slave fought for the British, you'll be free. So, of course, in time, thousands of black fled plantations for British promises. This is how he's going to upset the Americans. He's going to take their slaves, make them run away, and promise them freedom if they join the war. Okay, so British kept their word, and then they evacuated the runaway slaves and these black loyalists, and they moved them to Nova Scotia, Jamaica, and England. So they took away the slaves, which of course to the south was property, and they needed that to feed the army, and they couldn't work. Okay, and then yes, the brutal truth is that only a select minority of American colonists attached themselves to the cause of independence with a spirit of selfless devotion. Okay, so you can see how this is the beginning of why they wanted independence, what was going on in the background, and who they were supporting, their strengths and weaknesses. So next chapter, we'll talk about how it actually started, the battles and wars. Okay. Okay, good morning. So we are chapter 8, finally. This is the independence. America secedes from the empire. Secede is another way of saying withdraw. So this is when America detaches itself from Britain. Now, this is like the second half of it all, right? Because the first half we talked about how all the people. Now we're going to talk about the actual war itself. So they had a second Continental Congress meeting. Remember the first one, they just said, let's try to go to the king and tell him, hey, let's try to work this out. Let's have peace. The king said no. So they had a second meeting, and then they knew what was going to happen. They knew that they had to declare independence. Of course, it's going to happen in July, right? First week of July, July 2, July 4. This is only May 10, so they're about to discuss that. Now, in the meantime, George Washington was sent to go to Boston. Now, George Washington was chosen to become the general, even though there was no official declaration of independence nor an official declaration of war. But Boston was the one that was under siege in a sense. Boston was the one that had soldiers there. There was the British there trying to, subject them. So they had to choose someone, and George Washington was always wearing a uniform in the meetings. He was always a very famous guy. He was a moral force. That's what it says. And even though he wasn't political, he didn't have much political experience. But because of his moral symbol, he was chosen to lead the way. And he said, hey, I'll only do this job as general if you do not pay me. Do you see that honor there? He says, I don't want to be paid, meaning that I'm not doing this for money. So why should you pay me? I'll only accept this if it's for free, and I'm doing this out of my free will. So that's the reason why he chose it. But in reality, it was really for political reasons why they chose him. Now, what do I mean by that? Virginia was the most powerful and popular colony that if Virginia joins in, then the rest of the southern states would join in. So they knew that Virginia was going to be a leader. Okay, so it's all messy in Massachusetts. It was Bunker Hill that had the area of action. Bunker Hill is in Massachusetts. And another site of action was in Ticonderoga, Crown Point, all in New York. New York and Bunker Hill were the places where they had these little skirmishes, these little battles. Now, an American force went to New York, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, and then they surprised the British garrison, and then they surrendered. The British surrendered the cannons, and that's how they got the cannons from New York. And then in Bunker Hill, the Americans were on top of the hill while the British kept going and going and going until finally in first, second, third waves, the British finally chased away the Americans. But the only reason why the Americans had to like retreat is because they ran out of bullets. Okay. So this is all there's already action. All right. There's already battle and conflicts already happening in America before even independence started. Now, I remember they sent a letter to King George in the First Continental Congress, and that was called the Olive Branch Petition, where they're asking for peace. They're saying, "Hey, let's make peace." Now it's kind of strange because King George is going to say, "No, there is no peace. Hang everyone in that room: Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, Samuel Adams, whoever's in that Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They all should be hanged." And it's kind of funny, right? Whoa, King George rejected it. It was his fault when the Americans wanted peace. Not quite fair to say because the Americans were already attacking the British in Boston. So it's kind of hypocritical to ask for peace when you're already attacking the British. So, of course, what can you expect? King George was going to slam the door on any hope of peace, on any hope of reconciliation. This is the Olive Branch Petition, the Congress' attempt to petition for peace. It didn't work. Okay, so what does the British do? They kind of make peace anyway because even before that, King George already hired thousands of German troops in a place from Hesse, so we can call them Hessians, and they came and arrived in red British garments in uniform, and they're ready to arrive in America, and they're headed to stop the rebellion. So they cannot even stop that from happening. All right, so throughout this course, there's a lot of battles, right? And it's going to be too much if we just go through the battles. We're going to see, okay, British won, then Americans win, and we all know the Americans are going to win in the end. So we have to just really go quick with the battles. It's hard to explain it. It's better if I could show it, but because of the COVID, I have to explain it. And when we start to advance, I will show more images later, how I could show you military history. But let's just go quick, brief, what happens here. So what the British start to do is they go to Maine. You see it's green. British burn Maine down. But this large attack involving some 2,000 American troops contradicted the claim of the colonists that they were merely fighting defensively for a redress of grievances. This is exactly what I was saying, that they were saying they want to address grievances, but they're already fighting anyway, so you can't really ask for peace. Irish-born General Richard Montgomery, formerly of the British, pushed up Lake Champlain and captured Montreal. He was joined at Quebec by the bedraggled army of General Benedict Arnold. So we can see that in the beginning that the Americans were sort of winning, but then Arnold got wounded, and but he was still able to defeat the British up there. The British set fire in Virginia, in Norfolk. Okay, so of course the British is going to win also as well, actually for the most part. In the South, the rebellious colonists won 2 victories, one in February, Moores Creek in North Carolina, and in Charles Harbor. All right, so this is just battles here and there. That's not really the big test. There's only a few battles that are really important, but it's really the philosophy behind it that's important, that's happening in the middle of this Revolutionary War. Okay, Thomas Paine, very, very important guy. Of course, what he believes is what is more important, because what he believes starts to spread, and everyone becomes a believer of his position. Now, it wasn't easy to convince many Americans to be anti-British, to ask for independence. Why would you go against Britain? It's a huge country. They could stomp on America, so people were so afraid of that. But then Thomas Paine says that's, think of this. It's common sense that we should be independent. Loyalty to the empire was deeply ingrained. Many people were ingrained in, being loyal to Britain. So many Americans had to really sacrifice a lot. Okay. And what was his philosophy? So this is what he was saying. Thomas Paine argued for superiority of a republic over a monarchy. Okay. A republic where we can get representation is so much better than a monarchy. So he produced the pamphlets asking for that. Said it's common sense to be independent. It's common sense that nowhere in the world did a smaller heavenly body control the larger one. Great Britain is smaller than America. America is huge. Why is the smaller island of England is controlling America? Okay, and also it's common sense because republicanism is better than monarchy. Okay, so independent is not just being separated and that's it. No, but it's calling for a new creation of a new political society, which is a republic. Instead, where the power was coming from the king, it was now coming from the people. Remember how the king was in control of everything? Well, what if we could have a government where it's controlled by the people? This is what he was shooting for. And people were saying, hey, we can now elect our governors, our senators, get our judges in there. And instead of getting always the king to decide everything, wouldn't it be nice to have this kind of system instead of a king and a monarchy? This is what Thomas Paine was aiming for. This is republicanism. Okay, so basically, if there's too much power at the hands of one guy, the king, this is wrong. So they opt or choose the alternative, which is republicanism. So Paine's radical prescription for the colonies to reject monarchy and empire and embrace an independent republic fell on receptive ears, meaning many people like this. They're like, you know what, this makes sense. Why can't America become like this? Do we have to become a monarchy? Okay, Now, America was practicing, in a sense, sort of republicanism. They were having town meetings. They were electing their own governors already, having annual elections. So this wasn't something new. They were getting used to it already. But here's the problem. If it's going to be majority vote when you elect people, then who could they elect? What if they elect someone crazy? What if they elect someone immoral? Wouldn't an immoral people elect an immoral person? That's why they said this. Most Americans considered citizen virtue fundamental to any successful Republican government. Meaning, in order to have good leaders, you got to have good people, because the good people will choose the good leaders. But if people become bad, then obviously they're going to choose the bad leaders. Okay? So the collective good of the people was at stake, and that to protect their private rights and interests as individuals. Republicanism, for them, meant an end to hereditary aristocracy, but not an end to all social hierarchy. Yes, they want to get rid of this high class aristocratic people who just are permanently rich, but it didn't mean they wanted to end it. They were going to have social hierarchy, meaning there's going to be high class, middle class, low class. That was still going to be available, just not the way England did it. Okay. Okay. So Jefferson, explanation of independence, right? Thomas Jefferson is the guy who they chose. Hey, he's the smartest writer in the room. Jefferson was very shy. He wasn't good at speaking. But when they saw the way he wrote, wow, he was a great, great writer. This is not Jefferson, by the way. This is King George. I know it's just weird to put them side by side. See, King George. Okay, but finally, July 2, they all motioned, or June 7, Henry Lee said, let's vote for independence. All these colonies, let's decide. Let's debate about it. So they were debating for about a month. No, we don't want to be independent. Some said yes, some said no. Finally, they negotiated. They said, okay. July 2nd, the motion passed. They declared independence. Now, why is it July 2nd? Isn't July 4th when we have all the barbecue parties on the beach? Because it took 2 days for them to publicly announce it in the papers and celebrate it, right? In the room, they knew about it, but not the people. The people did not know that it was independence until July 4th it was announced. Okay. So John Adams was the forerunner of leading this debate for getting everyone to support independence. Thomas Jefferson was one that drafted the Declaration of Independence, which all of the people in the Congress approved, and he defended the idea of natural rights. You know, this is from John Locke, this philosopher in England. But he was saying that they have rights, the right to all men are created equal, the private property. John Locke said that, and the pursuit of happiness. All these freedoms that they were trying to fight for. Okay. So the Declaration of Independence was a great success. People looked up to it. It was known as the shout heard around the world. Okay. So now when they declared independence, it's all or nothing, right? You're basically saying we have nothing to do with Britain. Now, Britain's not about clapping and saying, all right, good job. You guys, I support your independence. No, Britain needs America to make money. They need to get profit. So they weren't so supportive of this independence, of course. So they sent the military saying, hey, you are ours. Who said you're free? Okay. Okay, colonists loyal to King George are called the Loyalists, and those who fought for independence were the Patriots. So those are the two sides. Now, at the same time, there's political parties for example, in Parliament. The Tories were for the King's side, and the Whigs, in a sense, were for the American side, because the Whigs believed in rights. America was fighting for their rights because they felt King George was going against it. The Whigs always felt like that. King George shouldn't become too powerful. Think about the rights of the people. So that's what's going on here. Okay. So the loyalists who didn't want to switch to become independent, they had to run away. So there was like 16% of American people who remained true to the king. Loyalists were very like old style. They had wealth, education, very cultivated. Loyalists were also more numerous among the older generations. However, the young people, the young ones, they were more independent. They were supportive. They liked the idea. Okay, so that's the patriot, So a lot of the loyalists were the king's officers. A lot of loyalists were part of the Anglican Church. A lot of the loyalists were located in Virginia, New York, Charleston, Pennsylvania. Quakers were very loyal. Quakers had a hard time. General Washington felt that he was fighting in the enemy's country while his men were starving at Valley Forge. The loyalists were just everywhere. Okay, meaning that they were here and there. They couldn't know who was a loyalist, right? Everyone looked an American, but how do you know who's really a loyalist? What if they're a spy in America? But in any case, the loyalists ended up leaving. A lot of loyalists fled to Canada, several 100,000 of them. Some of them went to the Caribbean. They just couldn't stay in America, basically. Okay, so famous picture, you've seen this, right? There's other battles going on. Now, in 1776, so the year of independence, and then on towards Christmas, a lot of the Americans were actually losing. All right, now, before this happens, this is happening in March, okay? So early in the year, America had their first big battle after they declared independence, and that's the Battle of Long Island. Now, this is where they threw in all their cards, basically, a lot of soldiers, 35,000 men, okay? Washington, dangerously outnumbered, could muster only 18,000 men. 35 versus 18, what's the math on that? The British has 35, the Americans, 18. So they were going to lose, right? And they had a battle in the Battle of Long Island, and actually this battle was a big failure. because the British found a shortcut that flanked them, and the British came to their back, and they didn't know that the British were coming from behind. So they had to actually, they were retreating, they were running away through the Delaware River, and the Patriots, a lot of them got killed actually, and all George Washington was doing is running away. Now, this is when this comes in. Now, the enlistment was about to expire, meaning the soldiers only made a contract up to 1776 that year, and after that they could go home. Now, they want to go home. They're losing. If they keep fighting, they felt they were going to die. So George Washington says, if you guys quit now, then who's going to fight for independence, right? We're all going to be under the British. So he had to first motivate them. He needed a desperate win. So on Christmas morning or Christmas night or early morning, 26, he did a sneak attack. He surprised and captured 1,000 Hessians, remember the Germans who were working for the British, who were sleeping off in Christmas. So while they were in Christmas, he attacked them. And they were all asleep. And, now you might think, well, George Washington, crazy guy, he attacked in Christmas while it was Jesus' birthday. So cruel. And remember, this is Protestant country. They don't believe in Christmas. They are against Christmas. Actually, if anything, they picked Christmas to show them that they don't care about that Christmas, right? So, and then they had a victory at Trenton. So this is the picture we're talking about, the sneak attack. No one ever thought he'd cross that icy river, and he did. And then he was on a roll. Next, after that, Trenton, and then Princeton. And he won again. Okay. They knew that America had some tricks up their sleeves. So the British had to come up with a big plan. Combine all three armies together. General Burgoyne, who's coming from Canada, Howe's troops from New York, and Barry St. Leger coming from Lake Ontario. Basically, combine these three together. Actually, if the British people combine their three armies together, it'll be a big army, hard to stop. But here's the goal. What if America could stop them from combining, right? What if they could? And that's exactly what they did. Okay, so they were trying to combine, but thankfully, they were able to stop that combination, okay, from happening. All right. George Washington had some help from Baron von Steuben. Remember the Prussian drill master, training the men to become stronger and stronger. Okay. So this victory was important because when they defeated the British or stopped them from combining, then the French said, "Hey, America just might win. Let's support America." So this is the reason why France says, "Okay, we're going to give them troops. We're going to help them. We're going to come down there." So thankfully, France helped out, and there was even some ambassadors or diplomats who went for America, and that was Benjamin Franklin. Okay, Benjamin Franklin was sent to France, actually along with John Adams. Now, this is a new kind of diplomacy, right? No political connection, no military connection, only a commercial connection. Okay, now they actually wanted to have some ideas when they're making these relationships with other countries. Freedom of trade, freedom of the seas. This is America's philosophy right here. Do not be completely attached to someone, only commercially attached. But when you have a political attachment or a military attachment to a country, then that means you have to always support that country militarily. And that's what they didn't want. But in any case, the French says, "Hey, we're not going to not give you our military. We have to give you our military. That's how we know you're going to win." Okay, so in a sense, France offered the Americans a treaty of alliance, thanks for Franklin, who played skillfully on the French fears of Anglo-American reconciliation. So they were able to get a peace or some help. Okay, now there's other wars happening. Okay, Spain entered the fray against Britain, as did Holland. Combined Spanish and French outnumbered those of Britain. So the British had a lot of enemies, and all America had to really do was just find the enemies of Britain and get them to work together. Okay, but there are some nations who didn't want to participate. So you have this armed neutrality. Like, for example, Russia, Catherine the Great, organized it and said, "Hey, we are not going to be partakers of this war. We're going to be neutral. So don't try to get us to ally." All right. So it was really mostly the French and some other nations, but mostly French, who helped America. And Britain was already a powerful country. So the French came in. Comte Rochambeau landed in Rhode Island, and and it was just the beginning. It wasn't a lot, but one sad thing happened was General Benedict Arnold. He betrayed America and he joined the British, and he told all the secrets to the British. Remember Benedict Arnold, the one who fought in Upper New York? He betrayed America for a better position in the military, and he betrayed them. Georgia now was the British decided we got to fight south. Why? It's because in the north they were losing. Boston they were losing. Ontario they were losing. Remember, they couldn't combine. They realized, okay, let's go fight in the south. But even in the south, they couldn't win in the south. So they're actually some wins here and there, but ultimately the British were losing. So they were kind of retreating, right? And also they had help. Okay, and now the British employed Native Americans. The Iroquois Confederacy, Oneidas and Tuscaroras sided with Americans, but the Senecas, Mohawks, Cayugas, Onondagas joined the British. Okay, and the Mohawk chief Joseph join the British. And so it was hard because there were some Native Americans who weren't cooperating. Okay, but there were some battles in the West here. George Clark was the one that stopped this battle. This is the one in today's Missouri. Okay, even though America didn't really have a navy, right? They didn't have a navy, but they hired pirates. So America had pirates, and they turned the pirates into the navy. So that's what that's about. Okay, where was the final battle at? It was in Yorktown. And what happened is the main general, his name was Cornwallis, and he made a big mistake. He basically landed in between two rivers, kind of like in an island, and he thought that was a safe spot because the troops couldn't go to him because he was in between an island or in between two rivers. And he had his ships ready from the bay to come pick him up if ever he was in trouble. So he felt pretty safe. But the French general prevented the fleet, the British fleet, from picking him up and to bring him to safety. So all that was said to George Washington was, now he has no help. He's trapped between two rivers. We have to go get him now. So George Washington, along with Rochambeau, surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown. Yorktown is in Virginia. This is right next to Jamestown. Jamestown and Yorktown are at the same places. Pretty ironic. The first colony, now it's the last of the colony, right? That's where the last of the British is ever going to be there. So because of this, we have the entire British surrendering when they were bombarded by American and French bombardments. So when they surrendered, Cornwallis surrendered, it's done. It's over. American victory. The prime minister cried out, "Oh God, it's all over. It's all over." Well, it's not. George III wanted to continue. He still had 54,000 troops. Okay. Should he continue? Should he keep fighting? But the generals there did not want to fight anymore. There was too much things to fight for. So they said, we got to have peace. So they had a peace at Paris. The British had some people all over in India, in the Mediterranean. Actually, not just America. The British are falling apart all over the world. Okay. Okay. So now they have to sign this peace treaty. So what is this peace treaty? This is what it is. So important, right? What's in this treaty? Britain agreed to the independence of the United States. They said all of this is going to be America's up to the Mississippi. Spanish will get Florida. Okay. The British will keep Canada. This is the deal. All right. And then we're going to have peace. This is where the land is. Let's respect it. Okay. And the loyalists, do not persecute them. Do not give them back their land, their money. So all of this, a new nation was legitimized. A new nation was founded. All right. And now America can start. The French, thanks to them, they were able to help the Americans. Without them, America would have lost. Okay. All right. So this is the chapter for this. This is how they got their independence, and they had the French help, and now they're a new nation. And we'll talk about the next chapter next week. All right, so this is chapter 9, the Confederation and the Constitution. This is how America was independent and how they had to create a constitution, basically a government. But even before we get to these three branches of government, actually there was this temporary government that they tried to do called the Confederation, which had the Articles of Confederation, but it failed. So they're going to do an experiment, try this way, it's not going to work, figures that this way is better. The three branches of government, which we have today, and it outlasted other governments. Okay, so the idea of America's system was equality. How can we make sure that they have rights and that men are really being equal, as said in the Declaration of Independence? Because before this kind of system, a lot of things were unequal. So the philosophy behind it, the principle is social democracy. This is what they were attempting to do, to have a social democracy. They wanted to end this primogeniture. Excuse me. This primogeniture. They wanted to end this primogeniture. Now, many of the churches were not an Anglican church. It was a congregational church, mainly in New England. The Anglican church was in a different form because the king, in a way, was the head of the Anglican church. But now they had to de-Anglicanize it, right? What that means is take away the power of the king and make it a separate entity, which really weakened the church. So it didn't have as much power. But one of the passages that they wanted to make sure they put is religious freedom, which was what the Baptists wanted to do, to not have the government force any kind of religion, but let them choose. Okay. So also this was the beginning of some sort of abolitionist movement because the Quakers wanted to abolish slavery. So slowly and surely they would eventually get there. Okay, so moving on here. So this new era created a new set of culture and way of life. Republican motherhood is one of them. meaning that women now felt a better purpose than just being wives, but now they know that they have that they have the power to educate and to cultivate virtues in their family. So they took a big responsibility, and many of their children rose or grew up to be great mothers and leaders because they took a role in not just feeding them or whatever, but educating them with virtues. Okay. All right. So constitution making in the states. Now, the sovereignty of these new states, according to the theory of republicanism, would rest on the authority of the people. So what happened is they called a convention, and they wanted to create where the authority is not from a king, just like what it was before, but from the people. And they wanted to make sure that they had a Bill of Rights where some things were guaranteed, rights were guaranteed. Okay. But because of this, they had a weak executive branch because if there is no real authority head, then who is going to be calling the shots? Is a country okay without any government power at all? And this is what they wanted to do, reduce the power because they were so afraid of power in the government that the people said, we want to do the power themselves. Then what would be the point of government then? They cannot empower anything. So we're going to see this kind of confederation be established. Now, America was very limited because of the mercantilism and because of the navigation laws. But now that that's no longer applied, they can now trade with anyone. They went as far as China, as you can see here. So even economically, they were trading with China. So a big manufacturing just grew at this point. American ships were now barred from British and British West India harbors. Fisheries were disrupted, and bounties for ship stores had abruptly ended. America could now trade freely with foreign nations. So they are here in the Baltic. That's really like near Russia and China. So they're really spreading, and now they could trade. And unfortunately, they made profits 300% more than they did before the war. So this is what was a positive change. However, there was a shaky start towards union. All right. First of all, the British were still upset that they lost the war. So what they did is they made Americans depend on British goods. Now, how did they do that? There was so much British goods that they had to lower the price. So their prices were so low that people wouldn't buy American products, they would buy British products. So then this would kill the American industries because they wouldn't be making money because people would be buying it from Britain instead. So the British were still playing dirty economically. The 13 sovereign states were basically alike in government structure and functioned under similar constitutions. So what was the difference between this kind of government that they created? So they created something called the Confederation, but in reality, it was like having 13 countries in one. There wasn't like one government for all. It was more like, hey, Georgia's going to do things their own way. Massachusetts is going to do their thing. We're going to make our own money our own way. There's nothing we have in common. So in reality, it was like 13 countries in one, and they wanted to not work together. Okay. So all of this was the Articles of Confederation. What they had was basically a strong legislative branch, but no executive branch. There was no president under the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want a president. And they had big issues to solve instead. For example, the chief problem was the Western lands. Now, remember how the 13 colonies were at the east of the Appalachian Mountains? And now they got this whole bunch of land up to the Mississippi River. Question is, who would get it? Does Virginia get to get it? Does Massachusetts get to get it? Does Carolina get to get it? Who gets to get the Western lands? Should we divide it? Because whoever gets to have those lands, then they could sell the land and make money. Whoever doesn't have much of it, they don't get much money. So they had to come up with some system, and they had the Northwest Ordinance, that there would be a way to transfer this land. Okay, there's a way. Now, what would happen in this land, these territories? These territories needed to have a process to become a state eventually, and so they created a process for this. Okay. The Articles of Confederation is America's first constitution, 13 independent states linked together, but they had a lot of problems. Who would deal with foreign affairs? Shouldn't it be like just the United States of America dealing with it? No, actually, they didn't want to create a centralized system, meaning like one government for all. They wanted to have 13 governments, and each government would respect their own wishes. So when there comes to it, if a nation wants to come and negotiate with America, if France comes in, who would they negotiate with? Georgia? South Carolina? You know, Massachusetts? Who gets the right to say, hey, we represent America? So that was the problem. There was no executive branch. Okay, all bills dealing with subjects of importance required the support of 9 states. So if they would pass a law, 13 representatives, right? One representative from the colony, one colony, so 13 would get together. But if they want to pass a law, it would have to be at least 9. But that was actually very difficult to get 9 yeses to pass a law. So this kind of handicapped the Congress, right? Because 5 states could only come up with something, and the other 4 didn't want to believe. The other 3 were doing their own thing. The Congress couldn't do a few things. One, it couldn't regulate commerce, right? Who gets to decide commerce? Now, what do you mean who gets to decide commerce? For example, who gets to say Who gets to say England should only go to Pennsylvania to get bread? Who gets to say no, Georgia should be first in line? No, it's 13 countries. Pretty much they're going to fight. So they needed to be more united. They couldn't even collect taxes. So this was a very weak system, this so-called confederation. It was a loosely woven confederation, but it wasn't tightly knit. This was the problem here. Okay, because no one wanted to become too powerful because they were afraid it's going to be like the old times, like king. They need to have a centralized government to make treaties. Okay. All right. So, but there are a few things that were successful in a sense, a small way. The land ordinance, right? So, this provided that the acreage of the Old Northwest should be sold and that the proceeds should be used to help pay off the national debt. The vast area was to be surveyed before sale and settlement, thus forestalling endless confusion and lawsuits. So, this is the process now. Before they can sell the land, they first had to survey the land, plot the land, put it in the map, put 1 acre here, lot 1, lot 2, lot 3, and then they have to sell that to get rid of the debt. So that was one way they were going to solve that. So, and then when the land was sold, how can that land become a territory and how can it become a state later? So this is the Northwest Ordinance, which we talked about earlier. This is the process. First, there'd be 2 evolutionary territorial stages. The area would be subordinate to the federal government. Then when a territory could have 60,000 people, then it could be admitted to the Congress as a state. So if a state has 60,000 people, if it creates its own Congress, then if a territory could create their own Congress, their law, and if the territory could eventually have 60,000 people, then it could vote, then it could apply to become a state. This is the rules of the Northwest Ordinance. Now, I remember the definition is here, but I highlighted red earlier because that's when it was first mentioned. So you're going to find the definition of Northwest Ordinance here, the land ordinance definition here and here. Okay, so they found a way to expand America without having to defeat or conquer a nation. They just said, just get people to move there, and then you can create a territory. So here we go. They have them plotting the land, and this is 6 miles. This is 6 miles this way, 320 acres this much. So this is how they would survey the land, and they would sell it in these pieces. Okay. America was known as the world's ugly duckling. That means a lot of nations didn't like America. It was so new. It was a new kid in the block, and they didn't like it to be so successful so fast, because of course it's going to ruin the economy. If they do too well, then they're going to steal, customers, and then they would turn to America. So Britain was going to give them a hard time. You can see here that the British and Spanish are influencing them, especially the Native Americans, giving them a negative influence to turn the Native Americans against America. Okay. So the British didn't trade in the West Indies, didn't sell anything, and the British maintained their fur trade with the Indians. Okay. Spain didn't want to let America use the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River was important because the Mississippi River is right here, and if there's farmers here, they could go down the river and they could sell it to the outside world. Okay, but they didn't want to let them even use the Mississippi River. So we got a lot of issues. Spain and Britain together, radiating their influence out among resentful Indian tribes, prevented America from exercising effective control over about half of its total territory. And how did France give them a hard time? Well, France helped them, right? So you think that would, they would be good guys, but France wants payment back. Like, hey, we fought for you, time to pay us back, and America was in debt, didn't have that money. So there was a lot of problems. Also, this arrogant day of Algiers, the North African Muslim states, they were pirating and harassing the American ships. So they also had that problem when they go to Europe. Okay, now this is what said it all. There was an event that made it seem that, okay, this Congress is not, this confederation isn't going to work. And it was Shays' Rebellion. Now, when people are protesting, it's very embarrassing, right? If the government cannot control their own people, it shows that the government failed. If the people are upset, there's no peace in the nation. So something needs to change, and they had a rebellion, Shays' Rebellion. Basically, a Massachusetts farmer had to pay, and he was a veteran in the war. He fought in the war, but the government was taking away his farm because he couldn't pay the debt. Well, the government couldn't pay the veteran because the government had no money. So this is kind of messed up. He fought, and they're forcing him to pay a debt, and even though the government owes him money. So Daniel Shays started to get everyone who's going through the same way. He raised a small army, and they had a rebellion. Of course, it was crushed. It was kind of bad because they had to send soldiers and crush it and kill people. So Thomas Jefferson says this is what he was afraid about: democratic despotism, too much democracy. This is not the kind of America they expected. George Washington was embarrassed because he knew that everyone was laughing at America, that the people weren't even happy. So they realized they needed a strong central government. That's what was missing. Many were debtors who feared that a powerful federal government would force them to pay their creditors. Now, a lot of the Americans were tied to British debt, and they couldn't pay. They promised through the Treaty of Paris that they would pay that debt back. The chief differences arose over how this goal should be attained. How should they get? How can we unite the United States instead of getting it divided? Now they're worried if they unite and then someone gets all powerful over them all. Like, what if the government becomes super powerful and the people have to be subject to that government just like last time? Okay, so they had a convention. This was the problem: control of commerce. They had a meeting. Now this, please, is not a definition. I don't know why that's highlighted. I think it was meant to be orange. So if you listen to this lecture, you would know what to do. Do not use this as a definition. I could remove this highlight like this. Okay, but this is just important. Annapolis, Maryland, 9 states appointed delegates, but only 5 were finally represented. Alexander Hamilton set it up, but it still wasn't enough. It was trying to get people to talk about commerce, who would be trading with, should there be a rule about trade? If someone's going to go against each other, like what if Georgia and Massachusetts are competing against each other? Isn't that like kind of like almost war? So that they wanted to come again. But then they said, you know what? We got to get everyone here, not just 9. We got to get 13. So they met in Philadelphia the next year for the sole purpose of revising the articles. So they met in Philadelphia, great people: George Washington, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton. These guys were in this meeting. They call it demigods: lawyers, merchants, shippers. All of these guys are going to decide how to change this government, how to make it. Now, eventually, they're going to come up with this, what we have today. So let's go see what were the issues. How can they avoid a rebellion like this? How can their people's private property be protected? How can we trade with other nations and have good representation? So there's these 2 plans: the large state plan or the small state plan. So they're going to scrap the old confederation and come up with these 2 new plans, but they have to decide which 2. First, they know that they're going to have the large state plan was a bicameral Congress based on population. Now, back then, it was just 1 representative per state. But they felt that was unfair because Massachusetts is huge, Georgia is small. Massachusetts has 300,000 people, and Georgia has 25,000, and yet both of them get to send 1 each. Shouldn't Massachusetts have the right to send more representatives because there's more of them? But then, wouldn't it be unfair that Georgia won't have a vote just because they're a smaller state? Small state plan means just equal representation, 1 for 1. So what is going to be the decision? Then they came up with a great compromise. They said both. We'll have an upper house and a lower house. Every state gets to send 2 senators, and based on the population, they can send representatives. We call it the House of Representatives. So there'll be 2 houses. So that was called the Great Compromise. Now there was a problem though. They knew that they didn't have a president, so they said we got to get a president. Now they're worried that the president will be like a king, but they needed someone to execute the law, to do the law. You can make laws, but what if no one executes them? Meaning, like, you make a law, 75 miles an hour is illegal, make it 60, whatever. But who's going to go outside and catch people when they break it? There's no one. So they need someone to execute it, saying, okay, some leader has to come out and say, okay, all the cops get outside now and start arresting people. You needed someone like a president. Okay, but they didn't want the president to become too powerful. So the president had to be given limited power. So he had the power to, for example, wage war, to conduct the war, but the Congress has the power to declare war. So they didn't want to give the president all that power. And also, how are they going to elect the president? So they decided with an electoral college. Now, when people vote, they're not voting directly for the president. They're actually voting indirectly. So there is actually, people vote for a small group of people to vote for the president. Now, they wanted to do it that way, because they didn't want people to be manipulated. Like, let's say they just vote for any random guy just because, he's like their cousin or whatever. They wanted to make sure that there's only a set of people. Like, I'm going to elect this guy who's a smart guy, who's a well-known guy, and he's going to choose the president for me. Okay, he knows what's the best way to choose the guy, so that's just how they're going to do it. This is called an electoral college. There's about 500 people in the electoral college, and all it is when people vote, they say they're going to vote for Trump or they're going to vote for Biden, whatever, but they're voting for the people, a small group of people, to vote for that guy. This small group of people promises, I promise I will vote for Trump. So they put his name in. They say, hey, Van LaBranda, you said you're going to vote for this guy, so I'm voting for you to vote for that guy. That's how it works. Now, can the guy get in trouble? Yes, there's laws being made that you cannot vote to the other guy when you promise to vote for this guy. Okay, now what about the slaves? Do they count as population? Do they get a bigger representation? South Carolina has a lot of slaves. Maybe they could send more people down. So they call that the 3/5 compromise. Only 3/5 of the slave population will be counted. Now, slaves can't vote. right? But the question is, do you count them as the population? They're going to count 3/5 of them. The North felt that was unfair because they didn't have slaves. So that means the South could send more representatives because they have a lot of slaves. So they knew that that was wrong, but he got passed. Okay. Now that they had this system where they had a president, they had a Supreme Court judge, they had some courts and judges, the judicial system, and they had a Congress with the two houses inside, upper house for senators and the lower house for representatives. Okay. The only legitimate government was one based on the consent of the governed, and the people, the government should be limited. So now people felt, you know what? What if whatever these three branches, executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, what if they get powerful and still, abuse their power and take away the rights of the people? So this government wasn't complete. So there was two groups. They're worried about this. The anti-federalists opposed the government because they were worried that this government still can be powerful. What if this president says, you do this, you do that, you pay taxes, or else I'm going to. So an anti-federalist was formed. Anti-federalists were against the huge government. The federalists wanted this three branches. Who are the anti-federalists? Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. That's what they were worried about. And they're all about states' rights. Okay, they're saying we want to make sure when the government's created that it won't take away these certain rights. Okay, so not everyone was supportive of this new government. George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, they were the Federalists. They said, no, it's better if it's more organized. Okay. Okay. So now they had a great debate, special elections, and they had a vote. Would you want to ratify it? So 9 states said yes, 4 didn't want to. Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, they didn't want to approve this constitution. Okay. So we can call them the 4 laggard states. Okay. But finally, they were able to join in because they included something called the Bill of Rights. Okay. They're going to need to include that later, the Bill of Rights, and then they're going to be happy. The Bill of Rights is not mentioned here, but it's going to be mentioned soon. And here we have the Federalists and Federalist number 10 people who are just writing about this big deal, like why can't we form the government or not? But these 4 states didn't join in, but they're going to join in later because their rights are going to be included in this constitution. So we'll talk about that in next. We'll continue. Okay, that's about it. All right, good evening, everyone. This is chapter 10, launching the new ship of state. So we've learned how they redid the whole government. Confederation doesn't work. You can't have 13 governments. You got to have not just state governments running the place and a small central, but you need a bigger centralized government, a government that controls the whole nation without giving too much roles and authority to each of the individual state governments. So you would have 13 government nation, you would have one government nation, and that's what has to be done. And in this kind of government, they had the executive branch established, which they had the president. So that was one of the biggest difference. And so this is entitled Launching the New Ship of State. So they are now going to try and see how this will be, how much or how does your government could last. And it will last better than the others. Okay, growing pains. So the population was doubling every 25 years. So it was growing pretty quick, 4 million people so far. Vermont came in as the 14th state, and George Washington was now made president. Now, he was selected because of his moral character. That was mainly it, and where he's from in Virginia. But one thing he does differently is that he establishes a cabinet. That's one of the main differences. Now, what's a cabinet? Now, in the executive branch, there are secretaries that they can get. Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and the Attorney General. And of course, this is going to grow over time. Today, we have Secretary of Education, Secretary of Agriculture, Department of the Interior, all of these today that works with the president. But in the beginning, Washington only had the main 3 to take care of financial stuff. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, to handle foreign relations. Alexander Hamilton, Treasury, and Secretary of War, Henry Knox. So remember how there was a lot of, or the 4 states didn't want to join in, and that's because there was no Bill of Rights. And then the Bill of Rights is the first 10th Amendment, which had and included freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, trial by jury, all of these things to make sure that the government doesn't take away these rights just because it's powerful. And the crucial 9th and 10th Amendment was also there. That the 9th means that none of the rights that may not be mentioned should not be taken away. And the 10th is that the rights will be decided by the states, not the government. So this kind of assures that the people will still have their own rights in check, and that a president or the governor or whatever will not have so much power. So it made sure that the rights are still protected, because when you think about it, George Washington could still be a king. But what makes this different is that the Bill of Rights assures that the people will still have their freedoms not taken away by any leader. Okay, here's all the secretaries that will grow more. So what's the first thing that George Washington does? Is the Judiciary Act of 1789. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is a new organization of the court system. Back then there was just courts, but now they made 3 levels of court. The highest is the Supreme Court, and then in second is the circuit courts, and then the lowest is the district court. So there are one Supreme Court, there are 3 circuit courts for the north, the middle, and the south, and there's the district courts. There's 13. So why are there 3 levels? Because the cases are different. For example, if there's a Massachusetts case versus Georgia case, that's a circuit court. If there's a court for its own state, for its own problems, that's just the district court. But let's say there's a law or a case that deals with everyone or the nation as a whole, that requires a law that can be changed or something, that is the Supreme Court, one law. All right. And then the Chief Justice is the main justice out of the judges. So there's one chief and 5 associate justices. The chief is the head judge. Okay. All right. So the problem with America is their debt, and they borrowed a lot of money from other nations, and now they have to show that they are still credible as a nation. They have a lot of credit to resolve here. Hamilton regarded himself as a kind of prime minister to Washington. He was like George Washington's right-hand man, even though the vice president was John Adams, but George Washington really was, he was closer to Hamilton because they had the same belief system. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was the Secretary of State, and he was, in a sense, had a different belief system against Hamilton. Okay, so what was the objective of Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of State? Is to bolster the national credit, redeem their credit. You know how when you get a credit card, they check for credit? That means it's saying that how is your background? Have you paid your debt before? How credible are you? Are you able to pay back that debt? So he has to restore America's face, because they were known as a nation that had borrowed a lot of money. So are they reliable? Are they faithful enough to pay back their debt? So his goal was to fund the entire national debt at par, meaning he wants to pay back the nation, pay all the money back, but he's going to borrow money from something else and pay all those late payments. So that's funding at par. But even though he pays that debt, he just pulls a loan for that debt, but at least he'll be on time. So that was his plan, funding at par. Okay. The debt was separated, though. There's the nation's debt, and then there are state debts. Now, the debts weren't combined like all together in one lump. The nation had a debt because they borrowed money from other nations, and the states had a debt because they owed some soldiers or whoever served in the last war, in the Revolutionary War. They owe them too, so they have a debt to them. Now, the debt wasn't combined, but Hamilton had a plan. And everyone had a different debt. Massachusetts had a huge debt. Virginia didn't have a huge debt. So that's why they couldn't just combine it, because Virginia is paying off their state debt. They're pretty much almost done. But why should we put the debts together in Massachusetts, who's far from done? That's why the southern states especially did not want to join in putting the debt together. However, there was a deal that Hamilton made. And this deal was significant because Hamilton said, okay, if you agree to put all the debts together, then we will move the capital to Virginia. So they accepted. The Southerners says, okay, we'll combine our debts together, but you have to move the capital to Virginia, which is today's DC, which is north of Virginia. So they created the capital, and now Massachusetts and all the 13 states combine their debt together. Okay, you call this assumption, combining all the debt together. So here's the state debt, foreign domestic debt, debt owed by foreigners. Combine that all together. It's huge debt they had to pay. Okay. Now, how do you pay a debt? You pay a debt by passing some tariff. Now, a tariff is a tax on imports. When a nation is coming in, a foreign nation wants to trade, they have to pay a tax to go into America. If you raise the tariff, the more money you come in. But if you raise it too much, it'll scare away foreigners and they won't come in and trade. So here's the deal. If you lower it, more nations could come in, but you won't make much money, but you have to just leave it up to trade, or you could raise it, but then people will come in and pay a lot, but it's no guarantee they'll come in because it looks too expensive. So this is what they wanted to do. Now, Hamilton was for a high tariff, increased the tariff. So was George Washington. And then they also had an excise tax, a tax on domestic items, manufacturing places like whiskey. That was being taxed, but then they overtaxed the whiskey, especially the Scottish people, and they're gonna protest about this. Okay, now Hamilton has an idea. He proposed creating a Bank of the United States, a BUS. Okay, so that everyone could put their money into this bank, and people could even use this bank. Now, here's the problem. If you create a Bank of the United States, isn't that kind of unfair? Because what about the private banks out there? wouldn't people want to put their money into the Bank of the United States instead of their private banks in their own state? Yeah, of course. It's more, you can make more profit if you put your money in the Bank of the United States, because the more money you have, the more interest that you'll make. And automatically, these private banks in whatever, Georgia, Pennsylvania, will all go bankrupt because their banks are going to close, because everyone's going to pull out their money from their savings and put it in the Bank of the United States. Now, Jefferson was against that. He felt like that was abusing the rights, and it wasn't constitutional. It wasn't lawful. So there was an argument about this. Was it constitutional? Okay, so this is not a vocabulary term. I just made this look like it was very important to know. Was this constitutional? Was this okay to do? Turn that in orange. Jefferson says, nowhere does it say in the Constitution you can build a bank. Literally, there is nothing. It has to be said word for word. You call this strict construction or strict interpretation. Hamilton believed that, hey, where does it say that I can't make a bank? So that's called loose construction. He was very broad in general. He says, the government says that we have to collect taxes and regulate trade. So that means we have to make a bank. We can't collect taxes without a bank. So they had two different, loose construction and strict constructionism. Hamilton's views prevailed. Washington accepted it. Bank of the United States became law. Okay, and the Southerners were upset at that. So we can feel the North and South are being divided. Okay, so the Bank of the United States was created. Philadelphia was the capital where it would be held. So all of this taxing to pay the debt, especially the tax on whiskey, led to a whiskey rebellion, right? A lot of distillers were against this. They were just like the anti-stamp tax in the time they were under Britain. There was another feeling against the government now. They had a Shays Rebellion. Now they're having a whiskey rebellion. Let's see if the government is going to be able to put them down, or will they have a fight or conflict. Now the troops came in. George Washington and Hamilton came in, and the whiskey rebellion became small. People got scared. They ran away. This means that people respect the government, and there will be more order now, and they're afraid to cause some trouble. So this shows that this government is strong. It's respectable. Okay, the emergence of political parties. Now, political parties was something that no one expected the United States to have. It's not good to have political parties. It'll be nice if we're all just one happy family, but that's not true. Today we have Democrats and Republicans. At this time, we had something similar, but they were called Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans are one word. So in there's a lot of these parties that's always against each other, just like in the Parliament in England, Whigs versus Tories, and another one with Federalists and Anti-Federalists when they're creating the Bill of Rights. So here's a history of all of these parties coming together, all the way until 1860. This two-party system was unexpected, but actually it became important because it balanced out both sides of the politics, so no one gets too extreme. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of diplomacy. Now, the French had a revolution. The French also wanted to get rid of their king, which they did. So they guillotined their king. They went to King Louis's palace and they took him down and they guillotined him. Okay, so that was pretty strict. And was it a revolution like America? Was it the same? Actually, the Federalists like George Washington and Hamilton, who was not for that kind of revolution. People in France were cutting off heads and celebrating. This is a very horrible revolution. But Jefferson supported this revolution. He said it was great. And then Jefferson said, he responded, well, of course, it's like crazy. You can't expect despotism to liberty in a feather bed, meaning it's not going to be a smooth transition. It's going to be, chaotic. But anyway, Jefferson was really supportive of France. He had his office in France when he was Secretary of State, and he owed French his allegiance because the French helped him in the Revolutionary War. So the French has a Revolutionary War, and then later they have a war with Britain. So it's France and Britain. They've always been enemies with each other. What is the United States' position? Now, remember, they had an alliance here. America and France had an alliance. However, America says they're going to be neutral. This is kind of weird. Wouldn't I feel like George Washington just backstabbed the French? Like, hey, aren't you going to help us to fight the British? But they were saying they were neutral. Okay. Now, what the problem is, there was a man named Edmond Genet who came from France as an ambassador, and he started to recruit some Americans to fight against the British. Okay, now he was told not to do that because America is neutral, but he still did it anyway. So they had a talk. Okay, Genet met with George Washington, the president, and he said, "Hey, we had a deal." And then Hamilton steps in and he says, "Nuh-uh, we made a deal with King Louis actually, but you killed King Louis to prop up a new French government, so that cancels out everything. We didn't make a deal with you guys. We made a deal with King Louis." So this kind of a response upsetted the French. You know what? Forget you guys. We thought you were going to help us. Okay. So if the Americans had entered the war at France's side, the British fleets would have blockaded the American coast and cut off those essential supplies. So if they went against the British, then they would lose the economy. They wouldn't go against the French because they're partners. So the best position America felt they could take was neutrality. All right, now we have the Native Americans again causing and stirring up some trouble. So the British were supposed to leave, but they left some bases there, and again they instigated Little Turtle, war chief of the Miamis. The Indians had confederations, just like some nations in America. And in 1790 and 1791, Little Turtle's braves defeated the American army, Josiah Hamar and Arthur St. Clair. And so this Little Turtle wasn't obviously so little; it was very scary. So they had to. America sent their own crazy guy. General Mad Anthony Wayne had a battle, the Battle of Palm Timbers, and the British refused to shelter the Indians fleeing from the battle. And so the Indians surrendered, offered Wayne the peace pipe, and they signed the Treaty of Greenville. And finally, all of those old Northwest region, which is today's Ohio, Illinois, basically the region around the Great Lakes, that was given to America, and the Indians were given money to never start a war again. So remember, the lands are still, they have some Indians in the frontier, and it was still getting problems. So America will still have to battle these Native Americans one by one, era by era. Okay. The British did something wrong now. The British were impressing or forcing Americans to serve in the British Navy. This was generally wrong. Okay. And so America had a problem with Britain because Britain is forcing them to join in. Okay, so with that, they have to send Chief Justice John Jay to Britain to negotiate a settlement here. Now, this is kind of weird because you're not supposed to be meeting Britain because the deal was you made peace with France and you're not supposed to meet with their enemy, but now America's talking to them like they're friends, like they're back to normal again. So the French are upset at this. So they made a deal. The British said, okay, we will stop seizing the American ships. We'll stop forcing Americans to join this, military. But the British was supposed to evacuate all of their posts in America, but the British was not able to evacuate. So Jay didn't really do a good deal. So they're upset at Jay's treaty. Many people were upset because they were supposed to not talk to them, but they did. Now another guy made a treaty. Thomas Pinckney's treaty is like a Spanish-American treaty here. Spain granted the Americans virtually everything they demanded, including free navigation of the Mississippi River and a large territory north of Florida. So Thomas Pinckney was successful with the French in getting a treaty done. And this is what the provisions of the treaty were. George Washington could have been a president continuously, but he was only 2 terms. Now, back then, there was no rule. Today, you have a rule. You can only be the president for 2 terms, which is 8 years, 4 years each, so 8 years. But Washington said, you know what? I am not going to be president for the 3rd time. It was just too stressful. So at least with this, presidents are only there temporarily, so they could always get out and not deal with this stress to become president. The central government, its fiscal feet now under it, was solidly established. The West was expanding. The merchant marine was plying the seas. Above all, Washington had kept the nation out of both overseas entanglements and foreign wars. So Washington's job, he felt like he successfully did it. Central government, and they didn't get to go to war. America's too young to go to war. They have a lot of things to fix, including their debt. The next president is John Adams. All right, John Adams becomes the next president, and Thomas Jefferson could have been also the president. He wins 2nd place. Back then, if you're 2nd place, you become the vice president. So Jefferson was vice president. John Adams was the president. Okay. Now there was another Federalist group growing, extreme Federalists, known as the High Federalists. So there's like regular Federalists or moderate Federalists, and then there's the High Federalists, extreme ones who really want to go to war with France. And that was really led by Alexander Hamilton. So the Federalist Party was divided between John Adams's group, who are moderates, and then the extreme Federalists, so anti-French, and that was led by Hamilton. Now, there was almost a war with France with America, and this explains it all if you look at this picture in your textbook. So the French were also seizing American vessels. So John Marshall, who was Chief Justice in the future, sent by John Adams, hey, talk to these French people and say what's going on. Why are they doing this to our ships? But Talleyrand, the foreign minister, didn't want to meet. So he sends the lowest sort of secretaries of the job, XYZ, and they say, if you want to even meet him, you have to pay $250,000 to meet with Talleyrand. Yeah, this is a lot of money. This is almost like 250 million in reality. And America's supposed to pay that to give money? No one pays money to meet the ambassador. Ambassadors meet ambassadors, and that's a general rule. So nothing was guaranteed. This was insulting to pay in order to meet. It means America was worth nothing, and France is worth everything. And so many people wanted to go to war with France after that, when they just forced America to pay money. Of course, America didn't pay it. So they said, they'd rather pay the soldiers to go fight against the French. And so they expanded the Navy and the Marine Corps, and they're basically getting ready for war. They got the Navy ready. Now, they were very close, right? Should John Adams go to war? Now, the high federalism under Hamilton was trying to go to war. They really hated France. But John Adams sent John Marshall again, met Napoleon Bonaparte this time, and they made a peace. The Convention of 1800, they had a peace. So you call this little war that they almost had quasi warfare. Like there was like they had a little war in the ocean, but didn't go full out. So Adams avoided a war again. Actually, it's a good thing that Adams made peace, because what's significant about this convention is because there was peace with France, the Louisiana Purchase is going to be established later. Okay, the next thing is the Federalist witch hunt. So, there's many anti-French people at this time. Because of this anti-French feeling during this close to going to war against France, two laws: the Alien and Sedition Act. Okay, it just says alien laws here, but it's really the Alien and Sedition Act. Here's the Sedition Act right there. So, what does this mean? If anyone supports France, then they will go to jail. If anyone goes against America, they will go to jail. Now, there's a problem with that. Of course, they were just worried about spies and everything, but that's against freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And so, is this a legit law that the president has the right to deport dangerous foreigners in times of peace? If a foreigner comes in and says, "I support France," just because he's French, will he go to jail for it? And why did he make a law? That's not fair. So Jefferson spoke against that. Okay, it was a very, very big fight, and they passed the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. What this means is that they will not follow that law, the Alien and Sedition Acts that John Adams passed. They will not arrest people for their freedom of speech. Okay, so Virginia and Kentucky says, you guys can say whatever you want. It's your right. It's your freedom of speech. Okay, and they're basing it on the compact theory, which means that if the government starts breaking laws, taking away your rights, then you don't have to follow it. That's the compact theory. That's why they felt like they could pass these resolutions. They could make them, do whatever they want, because America broke the law first, the government. So that's the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Okay, so Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. These are the two parties that were against each other. Again, the Federalists were more like the best people. They felt like the elites, and the Democratic Republicans were more like the farmer types, right? It was really two different societies against each other. That high-class American versus the farmer. And the Democratic Republicans was the middle class and the underprivileged, the dirt farmers and laborers, as it was told. And the Federalists felt like they were those who supported centralized government. They believed they support banks, and they were for manufacturing. Okay, so today we had that, right? The elite, the educated, that was the Federalists. And then we have the regular guy, the farmer. They believe their moral people are better for the government. Okay? So when you look at these, this is a good way to look at the difference. Ruled by the best people, ruled by the informed masses, the general public. Okay, support a central bank, was against the central bank, wanted state banks. Restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of speech. Okay, so these are these two differences. And when you read that, it talks more about that. Okay, so that's about it for Chapter 10, George Washington and John Adams' presidency. Okay, we'll end right there.